The dust had not yet settled when the rancher saw her. A little figure stood in the middle of the road, barefoot, clutching two swaddled bundles against her narrow chest. Evening light poured over her tangled hair, painting her like a small silhouette of stubborn courage. Behind her, half hidden in the weeds that bordered the road, a woman lay crumpled on the earth, still save for the faint rise and fall of breath. Matthew Holt slowed his horse, the leather reins creaking beneath his calloused hand. He had seen cattle down, men shot, families undone by fever, but never had a sight struck him as this did. The girl could not have been more than 5. The twins in her arms, no more than a few months, squirmed and fussed, their thin cries breaking the late-day hush. He dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. The girl did not step back. Her chin lifted, though her lips trembled. There was no fear in her eyes, only the sharp, unrelenting plea of someone who had run out of choices. Her voice, thin as wind over prairie grass, carried steady enough. "Mama's legs have been shattered by in-laws, and you have no children." For a long breath, Matthew could not move. The words landed heavy, as if she had rehearsed them all day. He glanced toward the woman on the ground. Blood darkened the hem of her dress, her legs twisted in ways no leg should turn. Her face was pale, eyes closed tight with pain, yet her hand reached out weakly, searching for the little one standing guard over her. Matthew swallowed, his throat roughened by dust and something deeper. He crouched, lowering himself to the girl's height. The horse shifted behind him, iron shoes striking stone, the only sound until he spoke. "From now on," he said softly, each word slow as though it might break, "I am your father." The girl blinked, her lips parting, then pressed her cheek against one of the infants as if to shield it from the weight of what had just been spoken. Matthew drew nearer to the mother. She opened her eyes then, faint and unfocused, and he saw they carried the glassy sheen of a woman used up by cruelty yet still holding on. A whisper dragged itself out of her throat, unformed, unfinished, before her strength gave out. Carefully, Matthew lifted her into his arms. Her body was light, frail as straw, but every shift brought a low moan from her lips. He laid her gently in the bed of his wagon, then turned back for the children. The girl did not hesitate. She held the twins out toward him. He took them one by one, setting them down beside their mother, and then finally lifted the girl herself onto the seat beside him. The wagon wheels groaned as he guided the horse forward. The road stretched empty, shadows longing, and with each jolt the girl leaned closer into his arm, though she never let go of her watchfulness. For miles, silence pressed between them. The twins whimpered, the mother drifted in and out of consciousness, and Matthew kept his eyes on the road ahead, though the weight inside him grew. He had lived alone since boyhood, keeping land that felt too wide for one man. He had prayed for rain, for strength, for little else. Children had never once crossed his thoughts as something possible. Now 3 of them sat in his care, unasked, undeniable. At last the girl's small voice returned, softer this time. "Mama said you was kind. She said someone would come." Matthew's hands tightened on the reins. He wanted to ask who had done this to her mother, why no neighbor had stepped forward, why the world allowed such ruin. But the questions choked in his throat. What mattered now was forward motion, the road, the cabin waiting, the fire he would stoke to chase away the chill. The girl laid her head against his arm. The gesture startled him, for it carried a trust that he felt undeserving of. He did not pull away. The wagon rocked over stones, and he let the rhythm carry them toward whatever tomorrow might demand. Behind them, the sky deepened to violet. Ahead, the prairie opened wide, as if to swallow or shelter them. He could not yet tell. The horse slowed near the turn that would lead them off the main road and toward his homestead. The girl stirred, lifting her face, her eyes catching the last red streak of sun. She asked one question, clear and piercing, that cut through every wall he had built around himself. "Will you keep us, mister? Or just tonight?" The wagon lurched on, but Matthew found no answer. The cabin rose faint in the distance, lantern-light glimmering through the single small window, waiting to know what sort of home it would be. The wagon creaked into the yard long after night had taken hold, the stars brittle and sharp above the prairie. Matthew lifted the mother first, careful as he could manage, carrying her limp body into the cabin. The fire he had left earlier had gone to ashes, the room cold and smelling of dust and pine boards. He laid her down upon his own bed, the only bed in the place, and pulled a quilt ruff with years up over her shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, but steady enough. The little girl followed on her own, dragging the twins across the threshold one at a time, refusing help. She looked around the cabin with eyes too old for her face. The single table, scarred by knives and weather, sat surrounded by 3 chairs, their seats worn smooth. To her, it must have looked like a hall of emptiness. To Matthew, it had always been enough. He struck a match and set a lamp alight. Warm light spread across the plank walls, climbing up to the rafters, catching in the child's hair. She lowered the twins onto a folded blanket near the hearth, then set about gathering wood as if she belonged there. "You'll rest," Matthew told her, but she shook her head. "Fire first." He did not argue. He watched her small hands stack the wood with a kind of precision he'd only seen in grown women desperate to make something right. Her movements told a story. She had done this before, likely many times, though her arms were thin as reeds. When the flame finally caught, she crouched in front of it, her eyes reflecting the blaze like small mirrors of hope. The twins whimpered. She lifted one against her shoulder, swaying gently, humming a tune too faint to name. The sound filled the cabin with a tenderness Matthew had forgotten houses could hold. He busied himself with the kettle, setting it on the stove, pouring what water he had. There wasn't much to offer: some beans, a crust of bread, coffee if he stretched it. He had always lived lean. When he set the food before her, the girl hesitated. She looked at him as though testing whether this was meant for her, or for some ghost of his own. He nodded once. "Eat." She did, slow and careful, leaving more than half untouched. "For Mama," she explained. Matthew carried the plate to the bedside, spooning what he could into the mother's mouth. She stirred faintly, eyes half opening, but her body seemed lost to pain. He heard the faintest whisper pass her lips, a thread of scripture: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The words were cracked, yet steady. The little girl turned to him after a long silence. "Mama says the Lord sends who we need, but she don't always believe it." Matthew sat at the table, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. The lamplight carved deep shadows across his face. He had never been a man of many words, but something in the girl's steady gaze pulled them out of him. "I ain't fit for children," he said low. "Never held with family. Mine were gone to fever, for I was grown. Since then it's just been dirt and fence posts." The girl pressed her cheek to the twin she held, rocking slowly. "But you came." Her simple statement rooted in him, heavier than judgment. He stared at the wood grain of the table, tracing the scars cut deep into its surface. All the years of eating alone, praying only to keep his stock alive, none of it prepared him for the sight of that child, curled in front of his fire, waiting on him without doubt. Later, when the twins were finally quiet and the girl curled on the floor beside them, Matthew rose to drape another quilt over her small shoulders. Her hand reached out in sleep, clutching at his rough palm. The touch stopped him cold. He had not been held in years, and now a child's trust wrapped around his hand as if it belonged there. He knelt, letting her fingers rest against him, unwilling to pull away too soon. A quiet prayer slipped from his lips, barely breathed. "Lord, I never asked for kin, but don't let me fail these little ones." The cabin settled into silence. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, whispering of storms still far off. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped itself around the fragile gathering of souls. Yet when Matthew turned back to the bed, the mother's eyes were open wide, shining with unshed tears. Her lips parted, though no sound came. She looked at him not with gratitude, but with fear. Fear sharp enough to pierce through the stillness, fear that seemed to say she did not believe tomorrow would hold them together. And Matthew, standing there in the flickering lamplight, realized that though the child had claimed him, the woman had not yet decided if he was to be trusted. Sunday bells carried clear across the prairie, slow and solemn, summoning even the most reluctant souls toward the whitewashed church at the center of town. Matthew hitched his wagon at the edge of the street, hands rough against the worn reins, his jaw set against the quiet stares already gathering. Beside him, the little girl sat with her back straight, her chin lifted as if daring anyone to question why she clung to his side. In her lap, One of the twins wriggled, fussing. The other slept in a basket at her feet, swaddled tight. The mother was propped on a chair in the wagon bed, a shawl covering the ruin of her legs. Her eyes scanned the gathering crowd, faces she knew, though not one approached her with warmth. If there had been kindness once, it was long gone now. Judgment had taken its place, sharp as flint. Matthew lifted her carefully, ignoring the mutters circling like flies. His arms bore her weight with steady strength, though her shame seemed heavier than her body. He carried her up the church steps and settled her onto a bench near the front, where light filtered through colored panes and painted her face in trembling hues. The murmur in the congregation swelled. Women tilted their bonnets together, whispering. Men narrowed their eyes, some shaking their heads. The sight of a solitary rancher bringing a broken woman and her children beneath the Lord's roof was, to them, a spectacle too ripe for silence. One woman, her voice low but not low enough, said, "There he goes, taking in another man's shame." Matthew turned his head, eyes steady, though he spoke softly. "Names don't fill a child's belly." The little girl's hand slipped into his, small but firm, anchoring him before he could say more. Her gaze burned toward the whisperers with a fierceness he admired and feared. She had the look of someone who would fight the whole world if it came between her and the thin rope of safety she had found. The preacher stepped to the pulpit, his voice calm, carrying the weight of Scripture. "Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction." His eyes swept the room, lingering just long enough on those whose whispers had risen too loud. Silence, heavy and awkward, followed. Some shifted in their seats, adjusting skirts, tugging collars. But the judgment did not vanish. It lingered in every sideways glance, in every tightened jaw. The mother sat very still, her shawl gathered tight in her fists. Matthew could feel her breath quicken, as though the walls themselves pressed against her. She had braved cruelty from her kin, but here, in the house of God, shame cut deeper. She whispered, so faintly only Matthew caught it, "I should not have come." "You belong," he answered, the words more certain than he felt. The service droned on. Hymns lifted, prayers offered, Scripture read. But Matthew's attention stayed fixed on the children, the way the twins' cries quieted when the little girl rocked them, the way she watched every gesture of his as if measuring whether he was a man worthy of keeping his word. She was testing him without a word spoken. When the final hymn faded, Matthew gathered the children. The girl carried one twin herself, stubborn in her strength, while he lifted the mother once more. As they moved down the aisle, whispers rose again, sharper now that the preacher's voice no longer held them at bay. "Foolish," someone muttered. "He'll ruin himself. He ought to send them back where they came from." The girl pressed closer to Matthew, her lips set, her jaw tight. But it was the mother's face that troubled him most. Pale, eyes downcast, as though every cruel word had been carved into her skin. She did not resist his arms, but neither did she lean into them. Trust, it seemed, was still far off. Outside, the sunlight burned bright, the air sharp with spring. Matthew lifted her into the wagon once more, and the girl climbed up without waiting for him, clutching her twin fiercely. He settled the reins, the wood creaking beneath him, and guided the horse forward. The town watched them go. No one raised a hand in farewell. Dust rose behind the wheels, carrying them away from voices that lingered like thorns. For a long stretch of road, silence lay thick among them. Then, from the wagon bed, the mother's voice, strained, trembling, broke it. "Matthew Holt, I thank you for what you've done. But kindness does not last in this world. When it fades, where will you leave us?" Her words cut deeper than the whispers of the crowd. He did not answer. The little girl looked up at him, eyes wide, waiting to see if his silence meant surrender. The road stretched ahead, the cabin waiting at its end, but the question hung heavier than the prairie sky. Was he a man strong enough to be more than a shelter for a single night? The wind pressed hard against the cabin walls that night, rattling the shutters like bones knocking together. Inside, firelight stretched itself across the room in long golden ribbons, climbing up the walls, catching in the worn grain of the floorboards. The warmth clung to everything it touched, yet the air still carried the taste of cold. Matthew sat near the hearth, a boot in his lap, needle and thread in his hands, while the little girl hummed to herself as she rocked one of the twins. The other slept in a basket by her side, wrapped tight against the chill. The mother lay propped on pillows, her shawl drawn close. Her face was pale, lined with the sort of pain that seeps into a person until it no longer needs words. She watched Matthew without speaking, eyes tracing the rhythm of his hand moving steady through leather. At last she broke the silence. "You should not have to carry us," she said, her voice as brittle as the wind against the roof. Matthew didn't look up. "And yet I do." She turned her gaze toward the fire, the flicker of it dancing across her features, softening them for just a moment. "I am ruined," she whispered. "A woman with no use left but to be pitied. My kin saw to that. Now you've taken in their cast-offs, and for what? A burden no man should want." The needle paused in Matthew's hand. He tied the stitch, set the boot down, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice was low, steady, but it carried something heavier than he meant to let slip. "You think I never carried ruin of my own?" Her eyes flicked back to him, questioning. He drew a breath, rough as gravel. "I had a woman once. Fever took her before we'd been wed a year. Took the child with her, too. I buried them myself. After that, I swore the earth could have all of me if it wanted. I had no more to give." The fire popped, spitting sparks into the air. The little girl's humming faltered, though she kept rocking, her eyes fixed on Matthew with a seriousness beyond her years. The mother closed her eyes. "So why us, then? Why drag back the broken when you swore you had nothing left to offer?" For a long time Matthew said nothing. The firelight painted his face in shadows, making him look carved from the same wood as the walls around them. At last he answered, each word slow as if drawn up from a deep well. "Because the broken are the only ones who know how much a home is worth." The girl's small voice cut through the hush, clear as a bell. "You already kept us. That's enough." Matthew looked at her then, really looked, the curve of her cheek pressed against the twin she cradled, her eyes fierce though her body trembled with exhaustion. She had been mother and sister and sentinel all in one, carrying weight that should never have been hers. Yet she said those words as though they were truth beyond question. He reached out, steadying the basket where the other twin stirred. His rough hand brushed the edge of the blanket, and for a moment, all the noise of wind and fire fell away. There was only the sound of breath, the children's, the mother's, his own, woven together like threads in a single cloth. The mother turned her face toward him again, tears glimmering. "You speak as though kindness will hold against the world. But I've learned better. Cruelty has longer teeth." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Maybe so. But I've also learned silence can starve a soul worse than hunger. And I've been silent too long." The fire snapped again, the wind howling at the shutters, as if the night itself pressed close to listen. The girl bent her head and kissed the crown of the infant in her arms. The small gesture lingered in the air, quiet and strong, like an oath unspoken. Matthew rose, set another log on the fire, and stood with his back to it, the heat at his shoulders. His eyes lingered on the mother, then on the children. Something in him had already shifted, though he dared not name it aloud. To name it would be to claim it, and to claim it would be to risk losing it again. The mother's gaze held his, unflinching, as if daring him to keep believing what he had said. The little girl, still rocking, whispered one more line before sleep took her, "Papa won't leave. He said so." Matthew felt the words sink into him like a blade both wounding and healing. Papa. He had not been called that since the grave closed over the ones he lost. The fire dimmed low, casting the room into half-shadow. Outside, the storm deepened, and Matthew, staring into the flames, knew the night was not finished testing him. Spring came sudden, with a thaw so fierce it tore the ice from the river's back and sent it roaring through the valley. Matthew rose before dawn, the sound of rushing water louder than any him, and saw that the flood had broken his fence line and was driving his cattle toward the bend. He threw on his coat, boots heavy with mud, and hurried out with a rope coiled across his shoulder. The morning smelled of wet earth and pine, the sky pale with new light, but the danger was sharp and near. The little girl stirred in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, clutching one twin against her chest. "Don't go alone," she called, her voice trembling with the weight of command rather than plea. "I'll be back before the sun clears the ridge," Matthew answered, but even as he said it, the words felt thinner than he liked. He pressed a hand to the child's head in passing, then strode down the slope toward the river's roar. The cattle bawled, trapped against the broken fence, the current pulling at their hooves. Matthew waded in, rope flying from his arm, muscles straining as he tried to turn the beasts back toward higher ground. The river clawed at him, cold and merciless, dragging him deeper with every step. From the cabin, the little girl had followed. She stood now at the river's edge, the wind whipping her dress around her legs. She shouted above the roar, "You can't leave us, Pa. We're yours now." Matthew froze for the briefest instant, rope burning in his hands. The title struck him with the force of the river itself. It carried no question, only truth spoken by a child who had already decided where she belonged. The cattle lunged, nearly pulling him under, and the river swallowed his footing. He gasped as the cold surged higher, bitter as iron, but he tightened his grip, teeth clenched. With a last heave, he turned the animals, driving them back toward the bank, his body screaming with the effort. By the time he staggered onto dry ground, his clothes were soaked through, his breath ragged. The girl ran to him, twin still clutched in her arms, her eyes wide with terror and something fiercer, claim. "You can't leave," she said again, her voice breaking now, soft with fear. Matthew dropped to his knees before her, water dripping from his beard, his hands shaking as he reached for her shoulder. "Then I'll never let you go," he said, voice hoarse but certain. Behind them, the mother had managed to drag herself to the doorway, gripping the frame with white knuckles. She watched with tears streaking her face, not of despair but of release, as if something long clenched inside her had finally loosened. They moved together back toward the cabin, the cattle safe for now, the river still raging behind them but no longer claiming him. Inside, the fire had burned low, but warmth returned quickly as Matthew stoked it, his hands steadier now, his resolve firm. The mother whispered, barely able to lift her head from the pillow, "I feared you'd tire of us when the world pressed hard." Matthew shook his head, kneeling beside her. "I nearly drowned once before, in silence and sorrow. I won't let it take me again. Not while you and these little ones breathe." The girl placed the twin gently into his arms, the tiny body fitting awkwardly against his chest, yet perfectly as if carved for that space. Matthew looked down, his rough hands trembling as he cradled the child. The infant stirred, eyes fluttering open for a heartbeat, and in that fragile gaze he saw not burden, but belonging. The storm outside raged through the night, water battering the land, but the cabin held. Within its walls, there was no judgment, no whisper of shame, only the fragile weaving of something stronger than either cruelty or fear. When morning broke, the world lay washed and shining. The river had carved new paths through the earth, leaving wreckage in its wake, but it had not taken them. Matthew stepped outside, the girl at his side, the twins cooing in the doorway, the mother watching with a weary but steady smile. He set his eyes on the horizon, the sun spilling gold across the fields, and felt the weight of choice settle into him not as burden but as gift. It wasn't a mansion, or a wedding, or a promise made loud. It was stew on a wooden table, the laughter of children in a room too small, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. And maybe that was how homes were made, one small kindness at a time. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.